The wagon wheel cracked against a rock and sent Zelda Owens sprawling into the dust of a Texas road she had never meant to travel, her carpet bag spilling its meager contents across the dried earth, while her only means of escape rolled sideways into a ditch. She lay there for a moment, tasting dirt and defeat, wondering if the universe had finally tired of her foolish dreams of starting fresh in California and decided to leave her stranded in the middle of nowhere instead. The August heat of 1882 pressed down on her like a physical weight, and when she finally pushed herself to sitting, she realized with growing horror that she could see nothing but empty grassland in every direction, except for a distant cluster of cattle grazing near a creek bed. Zelda had left Missouri 3 weeks ago with a traveling merchant who had promised safe passage to San Antonio. But he had abandoned her 2 days prior when she refused his advances, taking most of her money and leaving her with an old wagon and a horse that had promptly gone lame. She had sold the horse to a homesteader yesterday for barely enough to buy bread and water, planning to walk the wagon into the next town. But now even that plan lay shattered. She was 22 years old, alone, and increasingly certain that her decision to flee her stepfather's house had been the last mistake she would ever make. She gathered her scattered belongings with trembling hands, shoving her spare dress and her mother's Bible back into the bag. The photograph of her parents, taken before her mother died of fever when Zelda was 12, had landed face up in the dirt, and she cleaned it carefully with her sleeve before tucking it away. Her throat ached with thirst, and she had perhaps half a canteen of water left. The creek where those cattle grazed looked impossibly far away, but it was the only water source she could see. Zelda straightened her bonnet, picked up her bag, and began walking toward the cattle. Each step felt like a small victory against the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. The sun beat mercilessly against her dark traveling dress, and sweat soon soaked through the fabric between her shoulder blades. She had always been practical, always been the one to keep her head when her younger sisters panicked, but practicality seemed like a thin shield against the vast indifference of the Texas landscape. The cattle were longhorns, she realized as she drew closer, with massive curved horns and wary eyes. They watched her approach with what seemed like suspicion, and Zelda stopped a respectful distance away, suddenly uncertain. She had grown up in a city where cattle were something you saw already butchered in the market, not living creatures with personalities and opinions. But the creek burbled invitingly just beyond them, and her thirst made her bold. "I am sorry to disturb you," she said aloud, her voice cracking slightly. "I only need to reach the water. I mean you no harm." The nearest cow, a rangy beast with a notched ear, swung its head toward her and made a low sound that might have been curiosity or complaint. Zelda took a careful step forward. "I know I am not supposed to be here," she continued, finding it oddly comforting to speak even if her audience could not understand. "I am not supposed to be anywhere, really. I thought I would make it to California, start a new life teaching school, but clearly I did not think that plan through properly." Another cow, smaller and with a reddish coat, ambled closer. Zelda stood very still, her heart hammering. The cow lowered its head and snuffled at her bag, apparently finding nothing of interest. "I do not suppose you could tell me which direction leads to the nearest town," Zelda said. "Or perhaps you know someone with a wagon they might be willing to sell very cheaply, or possibly give away for free to desperate women with no other prospects." She was so focused on the cattle that she did not hear the horse approaching until a voice spoke behind her, deep and startled. "They have needed you for years." Zelda spun around so fast she nearly lost her balance. A man sat astride a paint horse, watching her with an expression caught somewhere between surprise and something softer. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. His hat shaded a face weathered by sun and wind, and his dusty clothes marked him clearly as a cowboy. He looked solid and real in a way that made Zelda suddenly aware of how unreal she must appear, a city woman in traveling clothes talking to cattle in the middle of his ranch. "I did not mean to trespass," Zelda said quickly. "My wagon broke and I was thirsty and I thought perhaps the creek—" "You were talking to them," the cowboy said, and now she could hear wonder in his voice. "You were actually talking to them like they were people." Heat rushed to Zelda's face. "I know it is foolish, I was only not foolish." He swung down from his horse with easy grace, and Zelda found herself taking an instinctive step backward. He noticed and stopped, holding up one hand in a gesture of peace. "Sorry, miss, did not mean to spook you. Name is Miles Keaton. This is my family's ranch, but you are welcome to the water." He paused, then added, "And you are welcome to talk to the cattle all you like. They have been lonely." "Cattle cannot be lonely," Zelda said automatically, but even as she spoke, the reddish cow pressed closer to her side, and she found her hand rising to touch its rough coat. Miles Keaton smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something warmer. "That is what I would have said until about 2 minutes ago, but I have been running this ranch mostly alone for 3 years, since my pa died and my brother went east. These cattle get moved from pasture to pasture, get branded and sold, but nobody talks to them gentle. Nobody treats them like they have feelings." He looked at her directly, and Zelda felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "What is your name?" "Zelda Owens." She hesitated, then added, "I am trying to reach California, but I seem to have encountered some difficulties." "California is a long way from here," Miles said carefully, "and you said your wagon broke, among other disasters." Zelda surprised herself with her own bluntness. Perhaps the heat had cooked away her usual propriety. "I am beginning to think God has a sense of humor about my plans." Miles studied her for a long moment, and Zelda lifted her chin, refusing to look away. She had nothing left to lose after all. Finally, he said, "My ranch house is about 2 miles north. I have a housekeeper who comes 3 days a week, but she was just here yesterday, so the place is respectable enough. You look like you could use water and food and maybe a place to rest before you decide what to do next." "I promise I am not the kind of man who would take advantage." Suspicion warred with desperation in Zelda's chest. She had already learned the hard way that not all men who made promises kept them. But Miles Keaton's eyes were steady and honest, and the cattle pressed around her like they were vouching for his character. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "Because you talked to my cows like they mattered," Miles said simply. "And because my ma would rise from her grave and box my ears if I left a lady stranded in the sun." He gathered his horse's reins and gestured northward. "But the choice is yours, Miss Owens. I can bring you supplies here if you would rather take your chances alone." Zelda looked at the endless stretch of empty land, at her broken wagon invisible somewhere behind her, at the sun climbing toward its brutal zenith. She looked at Miles Keaton's weathered, honest face and made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. "I would appreciate shelter," she said. "And perhaps if you have work that needs doing, I could earn my keep until I can afford to continue my journey." Something flickered in Miles's expression, but he only nodded. "We can talk about that once you have eaten." "Can you ride?" "Not well," Zelda admitted. "Then we will walk." "Horse can carry your bag." Miles tied her carpet bag to his saddle, then fell into step beside her, leading the paint horse with easy familiarity. The cattle followed for a short distance, as if reluctant to let Zelda leave, and she found herself glancing back at them. "What did you mean when you said they have been lonely?" she asked as they walked, Miles was quiet for several steps. "My ma used to talk to them," he said finally. "Every morning and evening when she fed the chickens or hung the wash, she would walk out and talk to whatever cattle were in the near pastures, told them about her day, asked them questions like they might answer. My pa and brother used to tease her about it, but I noticed the cattle were calmer when she was around, easier to handle. After she died of pneumonia 4 years back, they got more skittish, mean even." He glanced at her. "I tried talking to them once or twice, but I felt like a fool, and I do not have the gentle voice for it anyway. But when I saw you there, and they were listening to you like my ma's old milk cow used to listen to her stories, I thought," he broke off, shaking his head. Zelda waited, but he did not continue. They walked in silence for a while, and gradually Zelda became aware of the landscape around her in a new way. It was harsh country, all thorny brush and dried grass, but there was a beauty in its openness, a sense of space that made her lungs expand. Missouri had been all crowded streets and narrow rooms, her stepfather's house a prison of peeling wallpaper and whispered threats. Here she could see for miles. "I am sorry about your mother," she said eventually. "Thank you." Miles glanced at her. "You said you were trying to reach California." Running from something or running towards something? The directness of the question should have offended her, but Zelda found she appreciated it. "Both, I suppose. My mother died when I was young and my father remarried a year later. He died 3 years ago, and my stepfather made it clear he expected me to earn my keep by marrying his business partner, a man of 50 with 2 dead wives already." She paused, old anger rising in her throat. "I taught Sunday school at our church and saved every penny they paid me. When I had enough for passage west, I left a note and climbed out my bedroom window at midnight." "That took courage," Miles said, "or stupidity. I am not yet certain which." "Courage," Miles said firmly. "Though I will grant that courage and stupidity often look similar until things work out." He shifted the horse's reins to his other hand. "For what it is worth, I am glad your wagon broke near my ranch instead of further down the road. There is a stretch of empty country between here and Gonzales that is not safe for a woman alone, or a man alone for that matter. Drought has made people desperate." The ranch house appeared gradually over a rise, and Zelda felt a small shock of relief at the sight of civilization, however modest. It was a long, low building of adobe and wood with a covered porch and a windmill turning lazily beside it. Outbuildings clustered nearby, including a barn and what looked like a bunkhouse. Chickens scratched in a fenced yard, and a dog rose from the porch to bark a greeting. "Hush, Ranger," Miles called, and the dog subsided into tail-wagging welcome. "He is harmless, just loud." Zelda found herself smiling as the dog bounded over to sniff her skirts. She had always wanted a dog, but her stepfather said they were dirty nuisances. This one had a grizzled muzzle and kind eyes, and when she scratched behind his ears, he leaned against her legs like they were old friends. Miles led her onto the porch and opened the door. "It is not fancy," he warned, but Zelda barely heard him. After weeks of sleeping in wagon beds and boarding house cots, the ranch house looked like paradise. The main room was tidy and spare, with a stone fireplace at one end and a sturdy table surrounded by mismatched chairs. Curtains fluttered at the windows, and the floor was swept clean. A door opened onto what looked like a kitchen, and another to a hallway that presumably led to bedrooms. "Sit, please," Miles said, gesturing to the table. "I will get you water and something to eat." Zelda sank into a chair and had to resist the urge to put her head down on the table and weep with relief. She heard Miles moving around in the kitchen, the clank of a dipper in a bucket, and then he returned with a tin cup full of water. Zelda drank it so fast she nearly choked, and Miles refilled it without comment. "I have beans and cornbread from yesterday," he said, "and some dried beef. Not much of a meal, but it will fill you up." "It sounds perfect," Zelda said honestly. Her last real meal had been 2 days ago. Miles disappeared back into the kitchen, and Zelda let herself simply sit and breathe. The ranch house was blessedly cooler than outside, and she could hear the wind turning the windmill blades with rhythmic creaking. Ranger flopped down beside her chair, and she reached down to stroke his head, anchoring herself in the simple reality of fur under her fingers. When Miles returned with food, Zelda ate with more manners than enthusiasm, trying not to reveal how desperately hungry she was. But Miles seemed to understand anyway, because he kept refilling her plate until she finally protested that she could not eat another bite. "Thank you," Zelda said when she had finished. "You have been extraordinarily kind to a stranger." Miles leaned back in his chair, cradling his own cup of water. "You said you wanted to work for your keep. Can you cook?" "Adequately," Zelda said. "I can also sew, clean, teach children their letters, do figures well enough to keep accounts, and apparently talk to cattle." A smile tugged at Miles's mouth. "The housekeeper I mentioned, Mrs. Chen, she is getting older and has been talking about retiring. She comes to cook and clean a few days a week, but the rest of the time I live on beans and bad coffee. If you were willing to take over the housekeeping, I could pay you wages. Not much," he added quickly, "but enough to save toward California if that is still where you want to go. And you would have a safe place to stay while you earned it." Zelda studied him carefully, looking for the trap, the hidden price. "You would trust a stranger in your house. You talk to my lonely cattle," Miles said, as if this were answer enough. "And I am a decent judge of character, Miss Owens. I do not think you are the kind of woman who would steal from a man offering help." "I am not," Zelda said, "but you do not know that for certain." "No," Miles agreed, "but I am willing to take the chance if you are." Zelda thought about the long road to California, the money she no longer had, the vulnerabilities of traveling alone. She thought about the quiet peace of this ranch house, the dog at her feet, the strange sweetness of those cattle listening to her words. "I would need my own room," she said. "The house has 3 bedrooms. You can take the one that was my parents'. It is the largest. And Mrs. Chen should know I am here, so there is no impropriety. I will ride to her place tomorrow and explain everything. She can come by to meet you, make sure you feel comfortable." Zelda took a breath. "Then yes, Mr. Keaton, I accept your offer, thank you, Miles," he said. "If you are going to be living here, might as well use my name, and I will call you Zelda if that is acceptable." "It is." Zelda found herself smiling. "Though I should warn you, I have never run a ranch house before. You may regret this offer." "Doubt it," Miles said. He stood and gestured down the hallway. "Let me show you the bedroom. You look like you could use a rest." The room he led her to was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in a faded quilt, a dresser with a clouded mirror, and a window that looked out over the pastures. Zelda's eyes burned with sudden tears at the sight of it, this private space that would be hers. She set down her carpet bag and turned to find Miles watching her from the doorway. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You cannot know what this means." Something shifted in Miles's expression, a softening that made him look younger. "Get some rest," he said. "We can talk more about the work later. For now, just recover from your journey." He closed the door gently behind him, and Zelda sank onto the bed. Through the window, she could see cattle grazing in the distance, small shapes against the huge sky. She thought about how strange it was that a broken wagon wheel had led her here, to this unexpected refuge. She thought about Miles Keaton's honest eyes and his patient voice, and the way he had called his cattle lonely. Zelda lay down on top of the quilt, not bothering to undress, and fell asleep to the sound of the windmill turning in the Texas heat. She woke hours later to the smell of coffee and found that the sun had shifted low toward the horizon, painting the room in amber light. For a disoriented moment, she could not remember where she was, but then memory returned and with it a cautious hope. She rose and tidied herself as best she could with the small mirror, then ventured out into the main room. Miles was sitting at the table, writing in a ledger by the light of an oil lamp. He looked up when she entered and nodded toward the stove. "Coffee is hot if you want some. I was just finishing the week's accounts." Zelda poured herself coffee and sat across from him. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. Why are you alone here? You mentioned a brother who went east." Miles set down his pencil. "My brother Nathan never liked ranching. After Pa died, he tried to stick it out for a year, but he was miserable. Had an opportunity to work for a shipping company in New York, and I told him to take it. Sold him my half of the inheritance so he would have money to start fresh." He shrugged. "I love this land." He did not. Seemed wrong to trap him here out of obligation. "That was generous," Zelda said. "It was practical. A ranch needs someone who cares about it, not someone who resents every sunrise." Miles paused. "What about you? Do you have siblings?" "Two half-sisters, both younger. My stepfather will make sure they are provided for in his way. They were always more compliant than I was." Zelda wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I sent them a letter from the last town, letting them know I was safe. I hope they do not worry too much. They are lucky to have a sister who thinks of them even while running for her own life," Miles said. They talked until full dark, easy conversation that ranged from trivial to profound. Miles told her about the ranch, how many head of cattle he ran, the challenges of drought and fluctuating beef prices. Zelda told him about her work teaching Sunday school, the children who struggled with letters and the ones who picked up reading as naturally as breathing. When Miles finally stood to light more lamps, Zelda realized hours had passed, and she felt more relaxed than she had in months. "I should let you rest more," Miles said. "Tomorrow will be a full day. I need to check on the herd in the south pasture, but I will show you around the house first, where everything is kept." "I am already rested," Zelda said, "and I would like to start earning my keep as soon as possible." Miles nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow we start fresh. Welcome to the Keaton Ranch, Zelda Owens." That night, Zelda lay in the large bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. She thought she should feel afraid, sleeping in a strange house with a man she had only just met. But instead she felt oddly safe, as if she had stumbled into a place she was meant to find. It was a foolish feeling, she told herself. Dangerous, even. She barely knew Miles Keaton. He might be hiding any number of flaws beneath his kind demeanor. But when she closed her eyes, she saw him sitting on his horse, looking at her with wonder, saying that his cattle had needed her for years. And despite all her usual caution, Zelda let herself believe that perhaps she had finally found somewhere she could stay. The next weeks fell into an unexpected rhythm. Zelda woke before dawn to start coffee and prepare breakfast. Miles would come in from the barn, where he had already fed the horses and checked on a sick calf, and they would eat together in comfortable silence. Then Miles would head out to work on whatever the ranch demanded that day, while Zelda tackled the house. Mrs. Chen came the second day and studied Zelda with sharp, assessing eyes. She was a small woman in her 60s with silver streaking her black hair and the weathered hands of someone who had worked hard all her life. Her husband had been a railroad worker, she told Zelda, and they had settled near Gonzales when the railroad pushed through 20 years ago. After he died, she had taken in washing and housekeeping to support herself. "You seem like a decent girl," Mrs. Chen said finally. But if Miles Keaton gives you any trouble, you come tell me. He is a good man, but all men need watching." "He has been nothing but respectful," Zelda assured her. "See that it stays that way." Mrs. Chen softened slightly. "His mother was a good woman, a friend of mine. She would want someone to look after this house properly, and to look after him too. He works himself too hard, that boy." With Mrs. Chen's guidance, Zelda learned the particular needs of the ranch house. She discovered that the stove temperamental and needed coaxing to maintain even heat. She found the cellar where root vegetables and preserved foods were stored, and the smokehouse where bacon hung fragrant and dark. She learned which chickens were reliable layers and which were destined for the pot. But her favorite task quickly became walking out to the pastures to talk to the cattle. At first, she felt self-conscious, aware that Miles might be watching from a distance. But the cattle gathered when they saw her coming, pressing close with their huge eyes and patient expressions, and Zelda found herself telling them everything she could not say to anyone else. She told them about her mother, who had smelled like lavender, and used to sing while she baked bread. She told them about the fear that had lived in her chest during those years under her stepfather's roof, the constant vigilance required to avoid his anger. She told them about her dreams for California, which were fading a little more each day but which she still clung to out of stubborn principle. The cattle listened. They did not judge or offer advice or tell her she was being foolish. They simply stood in the sun and breathed their warm, hay-scented breath and made her feel less alone. Miles never commented directly on her visits to the pastures, but she noticed that he began timing his work so that he was nearby when she walked out. Once she glanced up to find him leaning on a fence post, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. When their eyes met, he did not look away. "They love you," he said. "That is absurd," Zelda replied, but she was smiling. "Is it?" Miles climbed over the fence and walked toward her. The cattle shifted but did not flee, accustomed now to his presence. "Look at them. They are calm, happy even." The South herd had a cow that was refusing to eat, being stubborn about everything. "She is the reddish one there, the one standing closest to you. She started eating again the day after you arrived." Zelda looked at the cow in question, who gazed back with what might have been affection. "That is coincidence." "Maybe," Miles said. "Or maybe animals know things we do not about who has a good heart." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Zelda felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the sun. She looked away first, suddenly aware of how close Miles was standing, how solid he looked in his work clothes, how his forearms were brown and strong below his rolled sleeves. "I should get back to the house," she said quickly. "I have bread rising." Miles nodded, but she felt his gaze on her back as she walked away, and it took considerable willpower not to turn around. That evening, as they sat on the porch after supper watching the stars emerge, Miles said quietly, "I am glad you are here, Zelda. The house feels different now. More like a home and less like just a place I sleep between work." Zelda's heart stumbled. "I am glad to be here," she said, and realized how true it was. California seemed very far away and much less appealing than it had a month ago. Summer slid toward autumn, bringing cooler nights and the constant work of preparing for winter. Miles taught Zelda to ride properly, leading her in slow circles around the corral on a gentle mare named Bess, until Zelda's confidence grew and she could venture further. They rode out together sometimes to check the far pastures, and Zelda discovered that she loved the rhythm of the horse beneath her and the vast quiet of the land. One afternoon, they stopped to rest near a creek swollen with recent rain. Zelda slid down from Bess and knelt to splash water on her flushed face. When she looked up, Miles was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What is it?" she asked. Miles dismounted and came to sit beside her on the creek bank. For a long moment he said nothing, just picked up a small stone and turned it over in his fingers. Finally he said, "I need to tell you something, and I am afraid it might make you uncomfortable." Zelda's heart began to pound. "What is it?" "I have come to care for you, Zelda. More than I should, probably, considering you work for me and you are planning to leave for California." He looked at her directly, his amber eyes serious. "I am not trying to take advantage or make you feel obligated. I just need you to know that if you decide to stay, it will not just be as my housekeeper. I would like to court you properly if you would allow it." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Zelda stared at him, her mind racing. She thought about the last 2 months, the easy rhythm of their days, the way her heart had started to lift when she heard his footsteps on the porch. She thought about how safe she felt here, how happy, how right it seemed to wake in this house and work beside this man. "I need to think," she said finally. "This is unexpected." Pain flickered across Miles's face, but he nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Nothing has to change unless you want it to." They rode back to the ranch in heavy silence, and Zelda spent the evening in an agony of indecision. She had sworn never to let herself become dependent on a man again, never to trade her freedom for security. But this felt different from her stepfather's cold manipulations. Miles was offering, not demanding. Asking, not commanding. That night she walked out to the nearest pasture, needing the comfort of the cattle. They gathered, as always, pressing close, and Zelda leaned against the fence and let the tears come finally, hot and furious and frightened. "I do not know what to do," she told the cattle. "I am falling in love with him, and it terrifies me. What if I am wrong about him? What if I give up California and then discover he is cruel after all? What if I lose myself again?" The reddish cow, the one Miles said had been stubborn, pushed her nose against Zelda's shoulder. The physical contact was oddly reassuring, solid and real. Zelda stroked the rough coat and tried to steady her breathing. "But what if I am not wrong?" she whispered. "What if this is exactly where I am supposed to be, and I am too afraid to let myself believe it?" She did not hear Miles approach until he spoke from behind her. "I am sorry. I should not have said anything. I have made you cry." Zelda turned to find him standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands, looking miserable. "You did not make me cry," she said. "I am crying because I am scared. Of me, of myself, of wanting something I do not think I deserve." Miles took a careful step closer. "What do you want, Zelda?" She looked at him, this good man who talked about his lonely cattle, who had offered her shelter without demanding payment, who waited patiently for her to find her own answers. "I want to stay," she said. "Not just for work. I want to stay with you, but I am terrified of making a mistake." "So am I," Miles admitted. "Every day I am terrified that you will realize you could do better than a broke rancher with calloused hands and no prospects beyond this land." He moved closer still, until only a foot of space separated them. "But I figure being scared is better than being safe and lonely. At least if we are scared together, we have a chance at something real." Zelda felt something unlock in her chest, a tight knot she had carried since her mother died. "I do not want to go to California," she said. "I want to stay here. With you, with the cattle." Miles smiled, that transforming smile that lit his whole face. "Then stay. Please stay." "Yes," Zelda said, and then Miles was kissing her, gentle and certain, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious. Zelda kissed him back and felt like she was finally home. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Gonzales, with Mrs. Chen as witness and what seemed like half the town in attendance, curious about the woman who had appeared from nowhere to claim the heart of the reclusive Miles Keaton. Zelda wore a new dress made from fabric Miles had bought in town, blue as a summer sky, and Miles wore his only suit, brushed clean and smelling of cedar from the trunk where it had been stored. Reverend Walsh performed the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the little church. When he asked Miles if he took Zelda as his lawfully wedded wife, Miles's "I do" was firm and sure, and when Zelda gave her own promise, she meant every word with a conviction that surprised her. This was not the life she had imagined when she fled Missouri, but it was the life she wanted, truly and completely. They held a modest celebration at the ranch afterward, with neighbors Zelda was only beginning to know bringing food and well wishes. Mrs. Chen had made a small cake, and someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing on the hard, packed earth near the barn while the sun set in glory behind the hills. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had departed and only a few lingering friends remained talking quietly near the house, Miles took Zelda's hand and led her toward the pasture. The cattle were dark shapes against the twilight, and they stirred when Zelda approached, recognizing her presence. "Thought they should know," Miles said softly, "that you are staying for good now." Zelda laughed, but it caught in her throat, thick with emotion. She leaned against the fence and said to the cattle, "I am Zelda Keaton now. I live here. This is my home." The words felt like magic, like an incantation that could reshape reality. Miles put his arm around her waist, and they stood together in the gathering dark, watching the cattle settle for the night. "Thank you," Miles said quietly. "For what?" "For talking to my lonely cattle. For giving me a reason to come home to this house every night. For staying." Zelda turned in his embrace and kissed him, tasting joy and promise and the sweet ache of new love. "Thank you for finding me," she said. "For seeing me when I thought I was invisible." That night, in the big bedroom that had belonged to Miles's parents and was now theirs together, Miles made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to Zelda's eyes. He touched her like she was miraculous, like he could not quite believe his good fortune, and Zelda discovered that her body could feel things she had not known existed, pleasure that built and crested and left her gasping against his shoulder. Afterward, wrapped in quilts in each other, Miles traced patterns on her bare arm and said, "I love you. I should have said it before, but I was afraid it was too soon." "I love you too," Zelda whispered. "I think I started loving you the moment you said the cattle needed me." "They did need you," Miles said, "but I needed you more." The first year of their marriage was not easy. There were hard frosts that killed half the kitchen garden Zelda had planted, and a bout of fever that swept through the cattle and left them burying 3 calves. There were days when Miles came in exhausted and short-tempered from trying to repair a fence line in driving rain, and days when Zelda burned the bread and wept with frustration over her failures. They had their first real fight in January, a bitter argument about whether they could afford to hire help for the spring roundup, and Zelda locked herself in the bedroom for 2 hours before Miles coaxed her out with apologies and explanations. But there were also mornings when Zelda woke to find Miles watching her sleep with such love in his eyes that it stole her breath. There were evenings spent reading aloud by the fire, taking turns with a battered copy of David Copperfield that Miles produced from his mother's trunk. There were rides across the ranch with the wind in their faces, and the whole sky spread above them like a benediction. And there were the cattle, always the cattle, gathering when Zelda walked out to tell them about her day. She told them when she discovered she was pregnant the following spring, bursting with the news before she had even told Miles. She told them when her first son was born in the winter of 1883, a healthy boy they named Matthew after Miles's father. She told them about her fears and hopes, her small triumphs and failures, and they listened with infinite patience. Miles would sometimes join her for these conversations, leaning on the fence while Zelda talked. He never laughed or suggested she was being foolish. Instead, he would watch her with quiet contentment and say things like, "That reddish cow is nodding. I think she agrees with you." Matthew grew from infant to toddler, sturdy and fearless, with his father's amber eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. Zelda taught him his letters using the old Bible from her mother, and Miles taught him to ride before he could properly walk, sitting him on Bess's patient back and leading them around the corral. When Matthew was 2, they had a daughter, Grace, who had Zelda's dark hair and her father's serious expression. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. Miles made smart decisions about which cattle to sell and which to keep for breeding, and gradually they paid down the debts that had accumulated after his father's death. They added a room onto the house for the children, and a better barn for the horses. They hired a young man named Tom to help with the heaviest work, and later Tom's sister Annie, who assisted Zelda with the children and the endless labor of keeping a ranch house running. Mrs. Chen grew too old for regular work, but remained a constant presence, dropping by to offer advice and hold the babies. She was there when Matthew spoke his first word, which was cow, and when Grace took her first steps, heading determinedly toward the cattle pasture as if she already knew where she belonged. On their 5th anniversary, Miles gave Zelda a pendant on a delicate chain, a small silver longhorn that he had commissioned from a jeweler in San Antonio. "So you never forget the day I found you talking to them," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "I could never forget," Zelda said, touching the pendant. "That was the day my life began." They stood on the porch, watching Matthew and Grace play in the yard under Annie's watchful eye, and Miles pulled Zelda close. "Do you ever regret not making it to California?" he asked. Zelda considered the question seriously. There had been moments, particularly in the hard early days, when she had wondered what her life might have been if she had continued west. But those moments had grown fewer and further between until they vanished entirely. "No," she said finally. "California was where I thought I wanted to go when I did not know what I truly needed. I needed this life we have built." "I am glad your wagon broke," Miles said. Zelda laughed. "I am too, though I would not have admitted it at the time." They had 3 more children over the next 7 years. Another son, Samuel, born in 1886, and twin girls, Rose and Ruth, who arrived unexpectedly in 1888 and turned the household into loving chaos. The ranch house expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and the sound of children's laughter became as constant as the wind. Zelda never stopped talking to the cattle. Even when she was busy with babies and cooking and the 1,000 demands of ranch life, she made time to walk out to the pastures and share her thoughts with the patient longhorns. The children picked up the habit naturally, and Miles would often find Matthew or Grace sitting on the fence, chattering away to the herd about their adventures. "You have created a whole family of cattle talkers," Miles told Zelda one evening, amusement in his voice. "The cattle do not seem to mind," Zelda replied. "They do not. I swear the herds are calmer than any other ranch in the county. Tom says it is unnatural how easy they are to handle." "It is not unnatural," Zelda said. "It is just kindness. Everything responds to kindness, even cattle." As the children grew older, Zelda began teaching them formally, setting up a schoolroom in what had once been Miles's office. Word spread, and soon other ranch families were sending their children to learn from the woman who had once dreamed of teaching in California. Zelda discovered that she loved it, loved watching letters transform into words and words into stories, loved the moment when a child's face lit with understanding. Miles supported her completely, building benches for the students and helping her acquire books and slates. He would sometimes sit in during lessons, ostensibly checking on his children, but actually listening with rapt attention to Zelda's explanations of history or mathematics. "You are a natural teacher," he told her after a particularly successful lesson on the Revolutionary War. "Those children are lucky to have you." "I am lucky to have them," Zelda said, "and lucky to have you for giving me a place where I can do this work." The years flowed like water, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. There were droughts and good years, sick cattle and healthy ones, children's triumphs and scraped knees. Matthew grew tall and serious like his father, determined to take over the ranch someday. Grace was fierce and independent, insisting she would have her own ranch when she grew up. Samuel was gentle and bookish, more interested in Zelda's lessons than in cattle. The twins were whirlwinds, constantly in motion, impossible to tell apart except that Rose had a small scar on her chin from falling off the porch steps. Through it all, Miles and Zelda's love deepened and matured. The passionate intensity of their early days settled into something steadier but no less profound, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. They knew each other's moods and needs without speaking, could communicate volumes with a glance across the dinner table. On their 10th anniversary, they took a rare trip alone to San Antonio, leaving the children in Annie's capable care. They stayed in a hotel and ate in restaurants and walked through streets crowded with more people than Zelda had seen in years. It was exciting and exhausting in equal measure, and by the third day they were both eager to return home. "I thought I would miss this," Zelda said as their wagon rolled back toward the ranch. "City life, civilization, all the things I gave up. But I only miss the children and the house and the cattle." "The cattle," Miles teased. "Especially the cattle," Zelda said firmly. "They are much better conversationalists than most of the people we met in San Antonio." Miles laughed and reached over to take her hand. They rode the last miles in comfortable silence, and when the ranch house came into view, Zelda felt her heart lift with pure gladness. The children poured out to meet them, shrieking with excitement, and even the cattle in the near pasture seemed to raise their heads in welcome. That night, after the children were finally settled and the house was quiet, Zelda walked out to the pasture as she always did. Miles followed, as he often did, and they stood together at the fence while Zelda told the cattle about their journey. "We saw a building as tall as 10 houses stacked on top of each other," she said to the attentive herd. "And stores full of things we will never need, and people rushing everywhere like they had forgotten how to be still. It made me grateful for this place, for the space to breathe and think and be." The reddish cow, old now and retired from bearing calves, pushed her nose against Zelda's hand. Zelda scratched behind her ears and felt tears prick her eyes, though she could not have said if they were from happiness or simple, overwhelming gratitude for the strange turns life had taken. "I love you," Miles said quietly beside her. "I love you too," Zelda replied. "Thank you for finding me that day. Thank you for bringing me home." "You brought yourself home," Miles said. "I just had the good sense not to let you leave again." They stood in the darkness, surrounded by cattle and stars and the life they had built together from broken wagon wheels and lonesome hearts. And Zelda thought that perhaps God's sense of humor had not been cruel after all, but rather a strange and perfect mercy, bringing her to exactly where she was always meant to be. The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and joys. There were weddings to plan as the children grew to adulthood. Matthew married a girl from town, a practical young woman named Sarah who took to ranch life with the same determination Zelda had shown years before. They built a house on the far edge of the property and started their own herd, and Zelda delighted in watching her son become the kind of man Miles was, steady and kind and strong. Grace shocked everyone by announcing she planned to study veterinary medicine, one of the first women in Texas to pursue such a path. Miles supported her completely, helping to fund her education and proudly telling anyone who would listen about his brilliant daughter. Samuel became a teacher, opening a school in Gonzales that drew students from across the county. The twins married brothers from a neighboring ranch in a double wedding that was the talk of the region for months. Through it all, through grandchildren and great-grandchildren, through the changing times that brought automobiles and electricity, and a world that looked nothing like the one Zelda had first entered in 1882, the ranch remained. Miles and Zelda grew old together there, their hands weathered and their hair silver, but their love undimmed. On a warm spring evening in 1923, when Zelda was 63 and Miles 66, they walked out to the pasture one last time together. Miles's health had been failing, his heart growing weaker, and they both knew their time was growing short. But on this evening he felt strong enough for the walk, leaning on Zelda's arm while grandchildren watched anxiously from the porch. The cattle gathered as they always had, descendants of those first lonesome longhorns who had listened to a desperate young woman tell her troubles. Zelda leaned on the fence and said, "Thank you for being such good listeners all these years. You helped save my life, you know. You gave me a reason to stay when I might have run." Miles put his arm around her and she leaned into his warmth. "Do you remember the first day?" he asked softly. "Every detail," Zelda said. "You rode up on that paint horse and looked at me like I was doing something miraculous instead of something foolish." "It was miraculous," Miles insisted. "You were miraculous. You still are." They stood together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and Zelda felt at peace. Whatever came next, they had built something real and lasting. They had loved well and raised good children and treated their cattle with kindness. It was more than enough. It was everything. Miles passed quietly 3 weeks later in his sleep, with Zelda holding his hand. She grieved deeply, but without bitterness, knowing they had been granted more happiness than most people found in a lifetime. She continued to live on the ranch, surrounded by children and grandchildren, continuing to teach and work and talk to the cattle. On her own final evening, 20 years after Miles's death, Zelda walked out to the pasture one last time. She was 83, her body failing but her mind still sharp. The great-great-grandchildren of those first cattle came to greet her, and Zelda told them the story she had told 100 times before. "There was a young woman once," she said, "who broke her wagon wheel and thought her life was over. But she found some lonesome cattle who needed someone to talk to them, and a cowboy who understood what that meant. And she discovered that sometimes the life you are meant to live is nothing like the one you planned, but it is perfect anyway." The cattle listened, as they always had, patient and kind. And when Zelda closed her eyes for the last time, leaning against the fence in the evening light, she was smiling. Her children buried her next to Miles on the hill, overlooking the ranch, where they could see the cattle grazing in the distance forever. And for generations after, the descendants of Miles and Zelda Keaton continued to talk to their cattle, a family tradition that started with a broken wagon wheel and a cowboy who recognized loneliness when he saw it, even in a herd. The ranch flourished through the changing decades, through depressions and wars and all the transformations of the modern age. But at its heart remained the same truth that Zelda had discovered on that hot August day in 1882. That kindness matters, that listening matters, that love found in unexpected places can change everything. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blows just right across the Texas grasslands, people say you can still hear a woman's voice talking gently to the cattle, telling them stories, making them feel less alone. It is only the wind, of course, or imagination, or the echoes of 100 years of Keaton's keeping up a tradition that saved a lonely young woman and gave her a home. But the cattle know better. The cattle have always known.